So we can just welcome to everybody. I'm really honored and privileged to be joined by Professor Rashid Khalidi, who I don't really think needs to be introduced very much, as the probably world's most preeminent historian of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian national struggle, author most recently of the book The 100 Years War on Palestine, and just about preview of coming attractions. The next week, we're going to be talking to Karen Attiah of the Washington Post and Terrell Starr, basically about kind of Black politics and Israel-Palestine since October 7th. So that'll be next Friday at the same time. I know we have some people here who are Jewish Currents members, and then some people subscribers to my podcast. Maybe, Ken, it's worth putting the link to both of those things just in the link, so there can be some cross-pollination. So, Rashid, I wanted to start by asking you, you have spent so much time explaining to the world the history of the Palestinian national struggle, and seeing, over the more than a century against Zionism. I'd like to ask you, what, in terms of the Palestinian national struggle, what is distinct about this moment when you look at it in historical perspective?
Well, from a
In terms of strategies, visions, relationships with outside powers.
Yeah, I think we're at some kind of turning point. It's trying to describe a historical event when you're in the middle of it. It's like, what's going to happen in World War II in 1942? Who the hell knew 1942 what was going to happen in World War II? And I had this terrible feeling and when I'm asked these kinds of questions. It is clear that this is, from a Palestinian perspective, an event of traumatic proportions similar to at least 67 and 48, and maybe the 36-39 revolt. I mean, this is a huge event in Palestinian history. More people have been killed and more people have been displaced than ever before in Palestinian history. Proportionately, no. I mean, the people killed in 1948, about 15,000, were a much larger proportion of the total Palestinian population. The people expelled in 1948 were a much larger proportion of the total Palestinian population. But the numbers, I mean, we're over 30,000 when you count the 7,000 or 8,000 people buried under the rubble, killed, well over. Those people are not alive. And the hospital, the count is from the hospital, so we don't know. And when and if those bodies are brought to morgues, we will know the final tally. And they're killing 100, 200 a day. And there's no sign of that stopping. So we're going to have 1,000 a week for the next God knows how many weeks. So this is the largest death toll in Palestinian history. This is the largest number of people who were displaced, have been displaced in Palestinian history. And everybody feels this because we see it in a way that nobody could see the Nakba. Nobody could see what happened in 1936, 39. Nobody could see with their eyes what was happening in 1967. You got photographs or occasional flash on television. People are watching this in real time. Everybody, all Palestinians and all young people, whether they see it in social media or whether they see it through Al Jazeera or other non-Western, non-mainstream, non-corporate media, are seeing this in real time. So it's traumatic, probably in a way that earlier stuff may not have been, or with an immediacy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it has brought armed resistance, or the idea of armed resistance, right back into the center of a debate where it had been pushed to some extent to the side. I do not know where that goes. I do not know what that means. A lot will depend on the end of this war, who's standing where, and what happens in Palestinian politics as a result. And it's like, it's 1942. I can't tell you how that will sort itself out. And the impact of this won't be clear until it does sort itself out. Mm-hmm. Does the PA collapse? Is there a coalition government, Palestinian coalition government? Or do the various Palestinian actors, who were to some extent pawns of external powers, maintain the division and coherence of Palestinian politics in the present? So I don't know how that's going to go. And a lot of that will determine outcomes from a Palestinian perspective.
How do you, given the magnitude of this horror, as one of the most famous Palestinians in the world, how do you? I'm just, I mean, forgive me if this is a more personal question, but how do you function day to day, given the demands that you must feel to interpret what's
Right.
happening,
I
and
mean,
the magnitude of what you're seeing?
it's really, really been hard, not as hard as it is for people in Palestine, obviously, but by any means. But I have family. My niece's family is in Gaza. Her in-laws are all in Gaza, and we've been cut off from them for 7 days. So every day we wake up and we ask, "Are they okay?" And we don't know. There's no internet, no phones. Um, and I have family obviously in Jerusalem and in the West Bank and so on. So there's that concern. I was on a Zoom call with somebody in Ramallah. He said, "I have to go. I have to go." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "The army's downstairs. We have to get everybody out of the building." And he closed the Zoom call. So, Ramallah, it's just the army. They're not destroying buildings in Ramallah. They are destroying buildings from the air in Jenin and in Nablus and in Tulkarem and in Jericho and in other places. So, so it's hard. I was just looking at the buildings destroyed. The Guardian ran a series of pictures of the cultural institutions, and they didn't even include the universities. They just showed the mosques and some of the historic buildings. I mean, it's heartbreaking for a historian. It's heartbreaking for anybody who has uh, uh, any kind of respect for heritage and for the narrative that's linked to a building that goes back to the Mamluks or whatever it may be. It's not just the human horror; it's the cultural devastation. We have a list which we've put together of literally dozens and dozens of Palestinian academics who've been murdered in this war, including about a dozen people who are deans of faculty and 20 or so others, faculty and staff. And I know some of these people. We all know some Palestinian authors who, if I obviously I don't know him. I didn't know him. But the woman who ran the Edward Said Library in Gaza, established by Musab Abu Toha, the poet who just got out. Actually, he's in Egypt now. He founded something called the Edward Said Library. It had two branches. The library was destroyed, and the woman, this wonderful woman, who I was in communication with because I sent a bunch of my books there, and several of my colleagues did, she was killed with her family. So, how do you operate in those kinds of circumstances? I know that Palestinians everywhere are dealing with this, the personal and the impact of it. It's very, very hard. It's very, very hard. I'm sure many Israelis, all my Israeli friends have friends or relatives who are either, affected directly. One of my friends here, I believe her niece was kidnapped and released, and his niece's husband was killed on the 7th of October. So, I mean, a ton of people are dealing with this. Obviously, with 30-odd thousand Palestinians killed, you're talking about a level of it that's much greater than under 2,000 Israelis. But still, it's obviously an enormous thing to deal with in your head.
I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat. There's so many things that I would like to ask you, but you made the point that it's impossible to know in a moment like this where things will go. Maybe I'll change it and ask you where you think you would like things to go. What is the kind of Palestinian political organization, movement, vision that you would like to come out of this? Would it be a reconstituted PLO? What would that look like? What
Yeah.
would you like to see come from this horror?
I mean, I've been saying this as long as I can remember. It is imperative that the Palestinians renew and revitalize their national movement. Whether that takes place within the context of the PLO or some new formation doesn't really matter. The PA has to be, that whole period has to be put behind us. The Oslo Accords were a absolute, utter, and complete disaster for the Palestinians. And that whole framework has to be swept aside. And as long as it's there, it is a huge obstacle to Palestinian, to progress for the Palestinians. And most Palestinians now agree with that view. And the Palestinians have to not just unify their national movement, but develop a unified strategy to decide, to have a consensus on what they want. This is not means, a consensus on means. How do you get there? This is just to say, this is where we want to end up. And that's not going to be that easy, but it is not, in my view, impossible. There are enormous obstacles. The self-interest of the various political organizations, Hamas and Fatah and others, the interference of every power on earth, which has its fingers in the Palestinian pie, the Iranians, the Turks, the Qataris, the Americans, the Israelis, the Europeans, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis. I could go on and on. There are actually another half dozen or dozen, all of whom have their finger in Palestinian politics, trying to, by and large, keep the Palestinians divided and weak, and to keep their clients under their control so that they can have agents within the Palestinian arena. The Palestinians overcame that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they've fallen prey to it again. So the Palestinians have to unify their ranks, get a unified national movement, get a clear idea on what their strategy should be. And if you have those things, then you can diminish external intervention. And you can figure out how to go forward. And those are huge asks. I mean, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen easily. And if it doesn't happen, you're going to have things imposed from the outside, which have absolutely no connection with the aspirations and desires and rights of the Palestinians, imposed by self-interested external actors, all of whom have their own idea of what they want. And that's what we're going to get for the near term. And the question is, to what extent can that be disrupted, and can something constructive be put in its place?
Do you have any sense or about if there could be some legitimate process that was created in organization? I mean, my understanding is that, the PLO's vision originally was the secular democratic Palestine. There was this move towards this acceptance of a partition. Hamas's view is for some kind of Islamic state. I don't know exactly what they mean by that. Do you have any sense of what you think the next phase of what the Palestinian vision might be?
There's this fantasy illusion that Hamas wants an Islamic state, and that's what the original charter said in 1988. Every single person who wrote that charter is dead. So it is as dead as a doornail. I mean, anybody who refers to it is basically engaging in some kind of ridiculous propaganda. What they have tried to say, apparently, with varying voices saying completely different things over the past 20 or so years, is that they will not recognize Israel, but they don't mind if other Palestinians do, and they really want a two-state solution, and I think they want to dominate the Palestinian state. That's my guess as to what they wanted. Now, I think things have actually changed as of the 7th of October, and I will not predict what that change will entail. But I don't know that the people who held those positions, most of whom are outside of Gaza, will have any influence tomorrow in Hamas. I don't know who will. I don't know what the result of this war is going to be in terms of how Hamas is viewed by Gazans or other Palestinians, how the people who may or may not survive in leadership inside Gaza will relate to the people who are outside, if they survive, if Israel doesn't succeed one after another in eliminating. So I can't tell you. I have no idea. I mean, this is it's like you're standing in moving sands. Sinwar and Deif and his brother, and they could all be dead tomorrow, literally tomorrow or today. And the guys in Qatar and Turkey and Beirut could be dead tomorrow. And where Hamas comes out, only God knows in those circumstances. And that's not the only variable. I mean, there's this incredible jockeying going on in Palestinian politics outside of Gaza. And I have absolutely no interest in trying to predict what that may result in. Will there be a technocratic government tacitly supported by the political factions, which could do something? I don't know. Can they possibly agree? I mean, the self-interest of these leaderships they're politicians. I mean, look at this aged, semi-articulate politician clinging to power. And he's a perfect example. I'm talking about our president. He's a perfect example of what a politician is and what a politician does. And then the other one, the orange one on the other side, doesn't want to let go of the fantasy, and he may achieve it, of going back into the White House. These people never leave their chairs unless they're forcibly evicted. And that's true of these leaders, whether they're Hamas leaders or Fatah leaders or whatever other leaders. And there's no process for removing them. I mean, one of the things that we should have is a process to remove these people, get rid of them. An electoral process, obviously.
What you mentioned earlier, the new a greater centrality now of the question of armed resistance.
Right.
And I wanted to know, obviously, this is a very divisive and subject, and as you know, there's this kind of as traumatic as October 7th was for many Israelis and many Jews, there was also another kind of trauma in the sense that there was a feeling that it was not condemned in the way that many of us would have liked to see it condemned by some Palestinian activists. I know that many Palestinians find the experience of having to be, told they have to condemn Hamas before they can utter a word to be deeply unfair. I would love to know what is the right way, or would you advise people to think about the question of armed resistance in the struggle for Palestinian freedom?
I mean, anybody who asked me to condemn Hamas, I would ask them to, before they start that litany, to say, what are we condemning? We're condemning war crimes. Well, who committed more? I mean, if we're committing war crimes, we condemn all war crimes. I don't want to talk about the language of atrocity. I don't even want to myself in this conversation use the word genocide, just war crimes. I'm not talking about crimes against humanity. And I think there is genocide. I think there are crimes against war crimes, violation of the principle of proportionality, the principle of intentionality, simple stuff in international humanitarian law. If anybody's asked to condemn Hamas's war crimes, perfectly reasonable request. The questioner should be asked to condemn the war crimes of the other side. I mean, just look at the pictures of the mosques. Look at the pictures of the neighborhoods. Look at there's war crimes. There's manifest evidence of war crimes. So on the one hand, on the other hand. So that's that. As far as I'm concerned, anyway. I've talked about war crimes on both sides, and I have no problem with that. But what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And we're talking about 30-odd thousand Palestinians slaughtered, of whom how many thousand? 5, 6, 8, 7 may or may not have been carrying weapons at the time they were killed. Israel claims 9,000. Okay, that's less than a third. So we're talking about 25,000 innocent people slaughtered. That's not a war crime. So, I have enormous sympathy for anybody who was a victim on the 7th of, any civilian, certainly unarmed civilian who was a victim on the 7th of October, but the same sympathy and the same attitude towards crimes should be addressed to the other side. Armed resistance. I'm going to put this in a context that some people are going to find highly objectionable. If you look at the history of the violence employed, in particular by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and by some other Palestinian groups, from the beginning of the Oslo Accords, let's take the 90s, the first Intifada wasn't very violent, until today, you will see that it comes in the context of a systematic shutting of any possible door via any nonviolent means to achieve any Palestinian national aspirations. The structure into which we entered when we went to negotiate in Madrid and Washington preempted the possibility of Palestinian statehood, sovereignty, and independence. It was designed to push it into the indefinite future. And you start with the ground rules for Madrid, Washington, and then Oslo, and so on, and you go to a so-called pathway to a Palestinian state, the meaningless words uttered by the president and his secretary of state, which means sometime in mishmish, when the apricots bloom, the Palestinians may be entitled to have, in a limited form, with crippling restrictions, a fraction of what the Israelis have had since 1948, independence, sovereignty, and self-determination. That has been closed off by any nonviolent means. You march to the border in Gaza, and 300 people are sniped at and murdered, and hundreds are shot down and crippled. You launch BDS, and you're an anti-Semite. You go to the International Criminal Court, and you're whatever. So, and there have been no negotiations for the better part of a decade and a half. So Hamas grows in its propensity for violence in direct relation to the shutting down of any possibility of any nonviolent achievement of any Palestinian national aspirations. You know, from Rabin saying in the Knesset in his last speech, we're offering the Palestinians less than a state, and we will maintain security control of the Jordan River Valley, which means security control of a Palestinian Bantustan, less than a state, to what Netanyahu said yesterday. That's been absolutely consistent. And that means not a state. That means not self-determination. That means not sovereignty. That means one sovereign and one people with rights and one subjugated, subordinate people with lesser rights. Well, you do that to the Palestinians and you're going to get violence. And that's not today. That's not the 7th of October or the 6th of October or 1999. It goes right back to certainly Madrid, Oslo. So, you know, if you don't put the violence in that context, you're not talking about reality. You're talking about what propaganda wants you to focus on so you don't see what's actually happening in politics, which is the Palestinians are being denied self-determination, independence, and statehood. So if you want that, then, you know, dismantle the occupation, remove the settlements, and give the Palestinians a sovereign, contiguous, viable Palestinian state, or whatever the alternative would be to that. I personally don't care. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if everybody has equal rights in any of these possible formulations, two-state, one-state, binational, confederal, cantonal, I don't give a hoot, personally. But absolutely equal rights. Your mother can come from Brooklyn. My aunt can come from Damascus. No. Okay? You know, I mean, equal rights. Property. Religious, national, whatever. I don't care what framework that is to be established in, or if there's a transition from one framework. I don't really care. Anyway, it'll happen in the time of my grandchildren and my children, not my time, most likely. So I don't, you know, I won't have a voice. But that's the only principle I would stick to. And violence, I mean, I hate to say this, but Ireland would not have been free in 1921, but for a whole hell of a lot of violence. Algeria would not have been free in 1962, but for a whole hell of a lot of violence. South Africa would not have been free without a whole hell of a lot of violence. And you can say it's tragic, it's unfortunate. You can say these involve terrible violations of international humanitarian law, some of which was passed after 1921 or after 1962, some of these laws, which are now on the books as international humanitarian law. But it's true that violence, there would not be a United States of America, for heaven's sakes, if it weren't for violence. Hello? We're in a settler colonial reality, but it's a settler colonial reality which got independence from the mother country through violence. Hello? Every country in Latin America, hello, violence. I mean, I'm not a violent person, but I mean, I'm a historian, and anybody who doesn't see that is a moron. Mm. Sorry, I'm not trying to.
Right. But your point is that it's not, we would like to believe that nonviolence is always more effective than violence, but your point is that it's not always the case.
Sometimes it is. I mean, in a system of laws and sometimes in coordination with violence. I mean, the IRA in Ireland, I'm talking about during the Irish War of Independence from 1918 to 1921, employed parliamentary means, it employed diplomatic means, it employed boycotts, it employed all kinds of nonviolent means alongside violence. At the same time, they were assassinating 12 British intelligence officers on one Sunday morning. They had an alternative parliament, the Dáil, made up of elected Irish representatives of the Irish people who left the British Parliament, left Westminster, formed the Dáil, the Irish Parliament in Dublin, and said, "We're the legitimate government of Ireland." And by God, after 3 years of War of Independence, they were, and they are. That's the origin of the Irish Dáil, the Irish Parliament. is that the representatives elected to Westminster in Ireland who withdrew. So, there are enormously important political strategies that all of these liberation movements employed alongside violence.
We have a couple of questions just about Oslo, and I'd love you to just elaborate a little more. Do you believe that Edward Said called Oslo a Palestinian Versailles? Do you believe from the beginning that it could never have produced a sovereign Palestinian state? And what do you think was what was fundamentally wrong with the structure of Oslo from your perspective?
If I had believed that it couldn't lead to anything, I wouldn't have spent a large part of 2 years involved in the negotiations in Madrid and Washington. So I obviously thought something could come of it, or I wouldn't have wasted my time. I changed my view after 2 years of interaction with the American diplomats who were in charge, the Dennis Rosses, the Aaron David Millers, the Kurtzers, and the others, Richard Haas, all of these folks, and Secretary Baker himself. And I realized that that was not a framework that was going to achieve Palestinian self-determination. In fact, it was designed to avoid doing that. It was a framework that really was based on Begin's autonomy proposals of 1978, 79, which were then incorporated into a treaty with Egypt, which were designed to give Israel the potential to take absolute sovereign control of the occupied territories and to prevent a Palestinian state. And that's what the Americans and the Israelis were really moving on the basis of. And I only realized that well into the process. And unfortunately, that realization did not penetrate the minds of the PLO leadership, and they signed onto what we in Washington were not willing to sign on to, which was a deal
You
that
as the
guaranteed.
Palestinian representatives in Washington.
I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation from October 1991 until June of 1993, when the 10 rounds of bilateral negotiations with the Israeli delegation ended. And then behind our backs, in the meantime, Arafat and Rabin had agreed to a different path, which led the PLO to accept what I found absolutely unacceptable terms that had been proposed to us by the Americans and the Israelis working together in Washington. I wrote about this in an op-ed I wrote in the New York Times in September of 1993. I said, this is not going to work. So I never wrote, Palestinian Versailles, but I basically agreed with that by the time I completed that experience. He was right.
Well, you mentioned Algeria. So, there are, if we take, this was, instead of the South Africa, Northern Ireland case where the settlers stayed, this is a case where the settlers left. I'm curious in which, and again, I should say that in my view, in my view, political Zionism is a settler colonial movement. I think it's not only a settler colonial movement. I think it's other things as well, but that's for another conversation.
I agree. It is other things. I mean, it's a national movement that's created a nation state.
Yes, and it created Jewish refuge,
which is common to settler colonial movements. I mean, we live in one of them, for heaven's sakes. There's not an American people. Hello, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, this can happen. Usually in conditions of extermination and genocide. Let it be understood.
Right. So that's exactly the question I wanted to ask you. So South Africa and Northern Ireland are one vision of how this plays out. Algeria is another. In which the settlers leave. The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are another, in which the population that was there is so decimated that they're no longer a viable political entity. And I'm curious whether you think that either the Algeria result or the America result are not feasible, but could happen.
I think they're both very unlikely. I mean, there are fears and fantasies and traumatic concerns on the part of Palestinians, certainly, but also I think of Israelis, that one of those two extremes might come to be. I don't think either is likely. I think the resistance, not just of the Palestinians, but also of all the Arab countries to furthering Israel's aim of emptying Palestine as much as possible of its Arab population, is likely to prevent one extreme, which is the genocidal reduction of the Palestinian population to the point that it's no longer, as it is today, half or more than half of the population of what former mandate Palestine. And I seriously doubt there's any possibility of a nuclear-armed Israel ever being pushed into the sea or the Cyprus. It's not going to happen. Ain't going to happen, in my view. Neither of those is realistic. Does that prey on the mind of Palestinians and Israelis? Obviously it does. And in the Israeli case, it is being harped on by massed violins, which are raising every trauma in Jewish history. I'm surprised we haven't heard the Second Temple. We've had the pogroms, we've had Kishinev, we've had the Holocaust, we've had. I'm surprised we haven't had the Jews thrown out of England in the 12th century, or out of France in the 13th century, or out of Spain in the 15th century, thrown at us as what we should be afraid of, and therefore we should do whatever the government says and kill as many people as necessary to prevent this outcome, which is inevitable otherwise. Well, you have a propaganda machine working overtime doing that. In the Palestinian case, there is no organized propaganda machine, but those fears are being spread on social media and family to family. Anybody who talks to an older person, they say, "Oh, this is what happened to us in '67," or "This is what happened to us in '48." So, but I honestly don't think either of those extremes is likely at all, frankly. But who am I to say? The future, who knows?
Yeah.
I'm a historian.
To use this phrase that has become famous or notorious, depending on who you ask, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So when people
did you see that Netanyahu used the same phrase?
Yes. Right. So, the thing is, when people say Israel from the river to the sea, we know what that means, because that's what we have now, right? We know that it means one apartheid state. But I think that since we don't have a Palestine from the river to the sea, it's theoretical. So the question I would ask you is, if someone said is Israel Palestine or Palestine Israel from the river to the sea, I would imagine they mean an equal binational state. If someone says Palestine from the river to the sea, is that harken back to the PLO's vision of a secular democratic Palestine? Does that mean the Israeli Jews become Palestinians? What does that mean, that idea?
That every person who uses the slogan probably has a different vision. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's no unified Palestinian national movement. Mm-hmm. There's no clear Palestinian political objective, partly as a result of the hammering and smashing of Palestinian unity by every single external power in its own, serving its self-interest, preeminently Israel and Europe and the United States, but also every damn Arab and Middle Eastern power that's playing politics in Palestine. So you don't have a clear, there's no answer from a unified, the Israeli prime minister represents a parliament which was elected and can speak authoritatively on behalf of the Israeli people. Whether he represents them today in the polls or would win an election tomorrow is irrelevant. That's the government. You've got a president, you've got a prime minister, you've got a cabinet, you've got a parliament, the Knesset. They speak on behalf of that country as long as they're in power. You don't have anything similar. You have a Palestinian Authority that's supported by maybe 8% of the population, hated, despised by overwhelming majorities of Palestinians. They have complete contempt for them. And you have a leadership of Hamas which has never won a majority of Palestinian public opinion in any poll I've ever seen. Now, do you support what they did on the 7th? Yeah, but would you vote for them? They've never gotten. In 2005, they got 42.9% of the vote. That was the highest number they ever got. And if you look at their platform, they weren't getting it for armed resistance and an Islamic State. Their platform was so moderate you wouldn't believe it. I mean, it was completely didn't represent
Rashid,
what they necessarily really thought, but that's where they got 42%.
And that's because you just think most Palestinians don't believe in Islamism, political Islam.
Of course they don't. Of course they don't. I mean, the public opinion polls show that anyway. I don't know what people think, but I just, one has to go on the basis of the polls. But I think when you talk about from the river to the sea, you've got to finish the slogan, Palestine will be free.
Right.
So the alternative is Palestine being unfree, which is the situation today. It doesn't necessarily mean Palestinians are thinking, I want this kind of binational state with this. They say, we want to be free. That's what it is. It's a slogan talking about the absolute contradiction of the present reality, which is complete unfreedom of some sort for all Palestinians, whether they're expelled from Palestine, whether they live under occupation, or whether they're second-class citizens inside of Israel. they obviously don't feel free. They're not free to talk or demonstrate, for example. They don't have the right to purchase land. They don't, I mean, so they're in various ways. Even they who have rights within Israel, who vote and so on and so forth, who form a large part of the medical sector and the pharmaceutical sector and a ton of engineers and teachers and accountants and God knows what, even they don't feel themselves to be equal and free within Israel. And then the rest are even obviously much more deprived of freedom. So that's from a post-Palestinians perspective, that's the main thrust of the slogan. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's not from the river to the sea, who's going to govern? I don't think most people frankly, are thinking about that. And if they are, I promise you, they have a very diverse set of views as to what, if anything, that means.
I'd love you to talk about, Saeed said that to be a Palestinian in the West is to be a kind of an outlaw. And I wonder if you feel that still today, being at an American prestigious university, or whether you think it's changing, and that's not the case in the way that it might have been in the past.
No, I think it is changing for the better, because with young people, with people on college campuses, with a very large part of the intellectual elite in the United States, with most minorities in the United States, with ordinary working people in the United States, 4 unions have come out for a ceasefire, the UAW, unreported by the mass media, by the way. The only one that was ever mentioned was the UAW. Nurses, electricians, postal workers, diverse, large, working class unions and UAW have come out for a ceasefire. So, are Palestinians outcasts in American society as a whole? Well, not as far as a lot of working people and a lot of minorities and a lot of young people are concerned. Now, when you talk about the commanding heights of our society, the media, yes, obviously. The people who own the media and the 70 and 65-year-olds who determine what is on the screen and what the reporter is going to be asked to write and the framing of the article and where it goes and all of that, they regard us as, negatively. And that's true of our political elite, and that's true of the corporate elite, and that's true of the people who run American universities and who are answering to the people who own the universities. Private universities are owned as corporations by their boards of trustees. They're legally liable. They own us. We think that the faculty and the students are the university. No. The money is the university. These are private universities, like the art galleries and like, all of the foundations. The people who donate to them and are on their boards control them. And those people are not friendly to Palestinian rights. So do I feel that things have changed? Yes. I would never have seen 4 unions come out for a ceasefire 20, 30, 40 years ago. I would never have seen majorities vote in favor of BDS on a dozen or more American university campuses. I would never have seen this scholarly treatment of Palestine shift from it's not there or it's treated hostilely to a much more fair and balanced and open and realistic understanding of that. The Journal of Palestine Studies, which I co-edit, I'm stepping down actually from that job, has about 250,000 downloads every year. Now, that could not have been possible 30 or 40 years ago. First of all, you didn't have downloads. But that many people would be reached by that kind of an academic media. And these are mainly, peer-reviewed, long research articles. But that's what people writing PhDs and writing MAs and writing BA theses and studying Palestine have access to and are using. And that wasn't possible several decades ago. It didn't exist. So yeah, things have changed enormously in the United States, in my view, for the better. Especially among young people, but the commanding heights are still controlled by people who are fundamentally hostile to Palestinian rights and who are extraordinarily sympathetic to and influenced by the Israeli narrative.
And what impact do you think? I mean, that those forces have also now have suspended and banned chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine at different universities, including your own.
Right.
What do you think is the state of free speech at Columbia?
There's somebody at the door. I have to.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No
I will
problem.
be right back. I believe there's some action taking place on the campus today, and I just have to answer to this. Just 1 minute. I'm
Yeah,
really
no. Go ahead. Don't worry about it.
Talk among yourselves. I'll be right back.
I'll filibuster.
I'm
Um,
coming. Yeah.
uh, no worries. I'll just wait till Rashid is back, and remind people that again, our guest next week is going to be Karen Attia, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, and Terrell Starr, who's a journalist who now has his own Substack. Both of them have been writing some really interesting stuff about Israel Palestine, but especially about the kind of changing nature of Black political discourse in the United States on this subject. So that's going to be next Friday at noon. I think as I filibuster a little more, I mean, I think that it's really I think one of the things that's so valuable. There's so many things that's valuable of talking about Rashid, but one of them is just that he has been doing this for such a long time, and so I think he has a historical perspective. And I was really struck. I mean, he said it today, but I've heard him say it in other interviews, that I think it's precisely because he's been following this debate in the U.S. so close for such a long time that he's actually more optimistic than many younger people are, because they don't remember how bad it was in terms of the U.S. public discourse around this in the 1980s or the 1970s, when there were, when it was difficult to even assert that Palestinians were a people. And so I think that's, for me, one of the things that's really
Sorry
helpful.
about that, folks.
No problem. So free speech at Columbia and more broadly in the universities.
Well, I mean, you can see what's happening at the top level. You can see with the resignations of two of the three university presidents who spoke to a House committee that, first of all, this has to do with Palestine, but secondly, it's part of a much larger offensive against higher education on the part of the Republican right. At the same time, it has worked itself out on most college campuses in terms of, as you've said, suppression of free speech and suppression of academic freedom. We've had university events organized by faculty stopped, canceled, questioned by administrators. It's not just students who are having their free expression interfered with. That too. I mean, we had 18 deans at Columbia shamefully signing something in which they said that certain expressions are hurtful to people, especially to Jewish and Israeli students. I think they used the terms intifada, all means necessary, and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I wrote a response to these 18 deans. But what
maybe we can put that in the chat response.
Pardon me?
I'm just asking Ken to put your response in the chat, because I think it's
I mean, this is part of an effort to silence students, and what they're doing with faculty is more sinister and much more surreptitious. You ban SJP, everybody knows about it. You ban Jewish Voices for Peace, everybody knows about it. They don't know about how the Barnard president or the dean of the School of General Studies did this, that, or the other to stop the faculty from doing things, or call them in and interrogate them about this or that speaker. It's an outrageous violation of academic freedom, and it only operates in one direction. I mean, we have demonstrators calling Palestinian people supporting Palestinian rights terrorists and Hamas supporters and saying horrible, nasty things. I mean, who cares? It's hurtful, but that shouldn't be the miqyas, the thing determining political speech. What's miqyas? The standard for determining political speech. Hurtful? I mean, every time Trump opened his mouth, he's hurting people. Nobody cares. That's political speech. But there are forms of political speech which are effectively, we're being told, inappropriate and are not to be used. So, and so seeing a keffiyeh makes me feel bad. Well, seeing an Israeli flag makes me feel bad. Who the hell cares how I feel about an Israeli flag? It's nobody's business if I'm hurt or offended by seeing some symbol or some statement or some whatever. But that's what's driving a lot of these universities. You have donors, you have trustees, you have alumni, you have a tiny number of students for whom this is absolutely essential, that this stuff be stamped out. I mean, they can't argue. How are you going to defend 56 years of occupation? How are you going to defend administrative detention? How are you going to defend the burning of the town of Hawara by settlers? How are you going to defend a dozen or 20 or so Palestinian communities expelled from their property over the last 3 months. You can't defend these things. They're indefensible. How do you defend killing 30-odd thousand Palestinians? You can't defend them. So you shut down the speech of the people who are trying to raise these issues. And, it has not been very effective. I don't think it is going to work. In fact, it's going to probably lead to a boomerang effect.
You have, I mean, I feel like one of the stories that, as you say, that there's a kind of industry out there that is invested in telling the story of pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses is something that is menacing to Jewish students. But you have been teaching, you've been teaching classes on these subjects for many, many, many years. You've probably, classes that have, you've taught and mentored, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish students, along with students from all other different backgrounds. Tell me when you teach these classes and you structure discussions and you talk to students, what do you see?
I mean, I've seen an enormous change over time. I teach a course in modern Middle East history every year, which has between 200 and 300 students a year, at least 200. So I probably taught 4,000 students in this course over 20 years. And it has a component, only one part of it, a couple of weeks, are devoted to Palestine and Israel. And, most students are, Columbia has a very diverse student body. We have a lot of students from different countries. Some of them are Arab, some of them are Indian, some of them are Chinese. We have a large number of Jewish students. We have a large number of Black students. We have a large number of veterans. Columbia has the largest number of veterans, U.S. Army veterans of any Ivy League school. So, it's a very diverse group. I mean, I get a student every year who has served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Sometimes during the height of the war, maybe a dozen or half dozen, not a dozen. So, it's diverse. We have a lot of Israeli students, especially since the School of General Studies did a deal with Tel Aviv University. So we had dozens of Israelis go back to serve. Dozens. I don't know how many. I don't know the number, but a lot. A couple dozen, I don't know. A ton of people. And I have had, very, very few negative reactions in 20 years of teaching this. I will say the level of knowledge and openness and understanding of that student body has grown measurably over those 2 decades.
I wonder what it's like for you, what it is particularly like for you to teach students who have coming from having been in the IDF.
I mean, it's interesting, obviously. They're older, and that's actually positive because they do have a little bit of experience. Some of them I don't have any interaction with, I assume. It's a class of 200 people. The ones who deal with them on a daily basis would be their TAs. I know the ones who ask questions in class. I always take questions in class. And I know the ones who come and see me during office hours. And I know from my TAs exactly what's going on in their classes because I meet with them every week and we discuss in detail what's happening with each group of undergraduates. I teach the graduate students myself because it's a graduate section in this course. And I mean, I've had some amazing interactions with IDF veterans. I mean, one of them was a woman who was an officer and who taught in sniping.
Wow.
She was a sniping instructor, sniper instructor. Another one of them was teaching young men to drive armored personnel carriers. And I kept asking, why do they have women doing this? He said, the boys listen better. That's what the Army psychologists say. Anyway, those are obviously people whose thinking has evolved since they were serving in the IDF. And I've had many students like that. The ones who haven't, I guess they don't talk to me. Or they're the ones who write the negative when we get the evaluations, they write the negative evaluations.
How do you explain the fact that for so many people of so many different backgrounds, this question of the Palestinian struggle, especially recently, has become so important to them, and seems to be becoming kind of definitional for a lot of people about in terms of what it means to be a progressive. Why do you think it's a very small place? It's not at the center of global power struggle, which is probably in East Asia somewhere. Why this resonance?
I think, first of all, we're talking about the impact mainly on young people.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think about a generation or generation and a half that grew up in the wake of Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, pandemic. And they have a thirst for justice. I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about most of the young people who are active and involved and who feel this way about Palestine. They have a thirst for justice, and they see things as linked. So this idea of intersectionality, which is a political activist idea, it also is an intellectual thing for many of these younger people. They see Native Americans and they understand something about settler colonialism, and they see racism and discrimination, and they learn about Jim Crow, and they see how women are treated in the patriarchy, and they've been affected by all these things at a young, what's the word, age where they're particularly susceptible to feeling strongly about these things, climate as well, and they see all of it as linked. And for them, somehow Palestine fits it in an intersection of several of these concerns for justice in particular. They see it as particularly unjust, I should say. Why Palestine in particular and not other? I don't know. I mean, it could be that it keeps being thrust into their view.
Yeah.
Over the past 8 or 10 years, the number of attacks on Gaza and the greater prominence of an understanding of things like what is Jewish supremacy, what are these settlements really about, what is actually going on in Gaza. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have a good answer to it. But the background to it is what I said, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that, that the U.S. is a settler colony, a very successful one. And one of the things that I've been thinking a little bit about is what it would mean. I'm very struck that when I read Palestine solidarity literature, they refer to the United States, often the U.S. is referred to as Turtle Island. So there is an effort so what would it mean for Americans to take the Palestinian struggle and then refract it back on us? And how should Americans be thinking about what we need to do in the United States, given what we've done to our native population, that we could learn from a place where the settler colonial experience has not reached the same kind of end result that it's reached here?
I think that a lot of young people see in particular issues of race and issues of settler colonialism as feeding back into their understanding of the United States. I hear this from Black intellectuals and Black students. I hear it from Native Americans. I hear it from ordinary kids, ordinary students, that yes, this should make us reflect. When we talk about apartheid there, well, what about segregation here? De facto segregation. What about racial discrimination here? When we talk about settler colonialism in Palestine, well, what does that mean in terms of Native Americans and so on and so forth? So I do think it's refracted back, frankly, for many of these young people anyway.
Yeah. One of the things that has always struck me about you since the first time I met you and all the years that I've been reading you and came through in this conversation too, is your generosity of spirit. You're talking about teaching a student who was a sniper, who could have shot your own relatives, and you speak about it in almost a kind of—
not her students. She wasn't a sniper. She was a sniper.
Okay. She taught people how to do that.
Yes.
And yet you're not saying I will not teach this person. You're not even saying I hold them in contempt.
I only found this out after I had taught her, by the way, when she came in to talk to me.
But you also made a point in your first answer, when you were talking about what was happening in Gaza, of talking about how traumatic it was for Israeli friends of yours, who had family who had been—
or American friends
been killed. So I'm just curious, this is clearly a moment when the ability to be generous and empathetic is very, very difficult for a lot of people, given the amount of trauma and agony and rage. And I'm just curious, how do you maintain that spirit under those circumstances?
I mean, look, a lot of younger people I know don't have what you just called that generosity of spirit. they are so angry at what they see happening to their families or to people they know. And some of them are there. I mean, I'm talking about young people I know in Palestine and others who have family there. Um, and many of them don't know Israelis, and many of them don't know people in the American Jewish community. I mean, I was born in New York. I grew up here. Um, Several of the colleagues who are the most involved with what we're doing on campus as faculty for justice in Palestine, they're Israeli. So, I mean, it's different for me than for one of my nephews or for some student who's literally never had a Jewish friend. I mean, I grew up in Mount Vernon, for God's sakes. Half my friends were Jewish. A little more than half, actually. So obviously it's different for somebody as old as I am and with this specific background to someone who has a completely different, a disconnect from American life, a complete disconnect from Israeli life. Nobody under the age of about 30 in Palestine has ever seen an Israeli except with a gun as a settler or a soldier, ever in their entire life. Whether they cross through the Allenby Bridge or whether they cross through checkpoints or however they don't go into Israel, most of them. They can't. They're not allowed to. So they don't see Israelis except soldiers and settlers. And most people who grew up in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Syria or wherever in the Arab world, they don't know Israelis. They've never seen any Israelis. You know, the young people now are coming to realize that some of our strongest allies in the United States are young people in the American Jewish community. And this is like a revelation to some of them. And this has been really wonderful watching. On our campus, they work together very closely. On most campuses, on many campuses, I don't know most campuses, the ones I know of, they work fairly closely together, SJP and JVP. And for a lot of these young people who come out of, whether they come out of communities in the Middle East or whether they come out of Arab American communities. I mean, if you're in Patterson, you don't have a lot of Jewish friends. If you're in Dearborn, if you're in Bridgeview, Illinois, if you're in neighborhoods I know in Houston, we're talking about large Arab American communities of tens and tens and tens of thousands where you can walk down the street and speak Arabic every day and never have a problem. But even those kids who are the most assimilated and the most, they may not even speak Arabic, but they don't have the same experiences. They come to campus and they find that their strongest allies are either Jewish or Black or gay or whatever. It's going to change their perspective. But to expect them to have the same attitude that I have, having been born here in the 1940s, is you can't expect that.
Yeah, yeah. My last question is, I wonder if you could just suggest for folks who a Palestinian novel, play, film. But I mean, I know you could literally thousands, but just something that comes to your head if folks wanted to, who may not be as deeply versed, that you think might give them a taste of Palestinian culture and experience.
I'm gonna do a little tooting of my own horn and suggest people look at my son's plays.
Wonderful.
Tennis and Nablus. He has two or three that are Palestinian themed. A play that he and Naomi Wallace adapted from a novel by Ghassan Kanafani, Return to Haifa. They should read Kanafani. I mean, Return to Haifa is a novel about two Palestinians in the West Bank who are able to go back to Haifa for the first time after the '67 war. And they will go back to their house and they find a Holocaust survivor living in it. And they're searching for their son, whom they were forced to leave behind in the chaos of the expulsion of 70,000 Palestinians from Haifa in 1948. So the novel is about this interaction between them, this woman, and ultimately their son, who shows up. And I won't spoil the play or the novel for you. So I would recommend Ghassan. I would recommend my son's works. I would recommend any poetry there's a whole ton of really great poets. Darwish, obviously, Mahmoud Darwish, obviously. Barghouti. There's a couple of really fine poets out there. Fadwa Tu'an. Novels, read Rajesh Hadi. Rajesh Hadi has some wonderful novels in English. Adani Shibli, Ibtisam A'azam. There's a bunch of wonderful Palestinian. Suad Amiri. There's a bunch of novelists and writers out there who are well worth reading. Any of the ones I mentioned, I would strongly recommend.
Thank you so much for doing this. I actually found it one of the most hopeful, actually, conversations that I've had since October 7th, and one of the most moving. And thank you, Rashid, so much.
I'm very welcome. I'm hopeful too. I mean, I honestly think that something better could come of this, but it's not going to be easy. And we really have to push hard. We have to push at the people who govern us. We have to push at the people who control some of these powerful institutions.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for having me. Take care.